first and get my glasses out. And then I've been making notes for several months. But anyway, what I'm going to start out with is when Granddad Cornwell came to Montana in 1887. And I'm going to qualify this statement that I'm going to make by saying that there are other members of my family that are a lot more historic than I am. And they may have a different version of some of this, but they can come in here and tell their own side of it. But as I said, and there's a little bit of confusion here to start with, because my dad always told me that Granddad came to Montana when he was 16 years old. But then I called a cousin of mine the other day and I said, well, when was Granddad's birthday? Well, she said it was the 16th of January in 1872. Well, if he came in 87, he'd only been 15. So I'm going to go with the 16 part. He might not have got his birth certificate right away. But when he came to Montana from West Virginia and went to a little town over northwest of Helena called Marysville, little mining town. And he worked there as a blacksmith, but his main trade was a wheelwright, which was rebuilding wagon wheels for the freight wagons, etc. And he, out here at Cornwell Ranch, there is a bellows built like this, only it's 5 times bigger. And I was just telling Lita a moment ago, I've seen pictures of that where they had this laying on a table by the forge, and then they had a hinge up in the ceiling with a stick on it with a rope to raise and lower this bellows. But as I said, that was his trade. My cousin Lee and I were over there 3 years ago, I think, and we went over to Marysville to have supper that day. And he told me that the depot that was there on the railroad is now the steakhouse in Marysville. They moved it from when they took the railroad out, they moved it up into the village and made a steakhouse out of it. Then later on, he got a job driving ox teams on freight wagons and coming to the Missouri below Fort Benton to haul freight back into the Helena area. And one of the things I really regret of never having researched with him was how did they handle him? Because everything you see, a bullwhacker's walking along beside him with a whip. There's nothing attached to the oxen except the yoke. And one time, years later, my dad had a friend, I think his name was Harry Alden. He lived up here towards Opine, Richmond country. And a fellow went through there with a team of oxen one time and camped not far away overnight. Harry told Dad, he said, I wanted to know how, because he just turned those oxen loose. And didn't know how in the heck he was going to get them hitched back up in the morning. So Harry didn't want to have to help him, so he sneaked over there and he's peeking over the hill. And this guy cooked his breakfast and got his stuff in the wagon. He said he whistled at those oxen and they walked in place and he yoked them up and was gone. And the Fort Benton Trail, you can get on a computer and look up freight trails, and it will show all of the old freight trails across the state. It shows the Bozeman Trail and a lot of others. They said the first trail going into the Missouri there below Fort Benton was really rough and tough to get through. And then later on, you all know where the Robinson Bridge is. As I have researched, I believe there was a Fort Carroll downstream from there. And there was also a Carroll Landing where these teams come in and pick freight off steamboats. And they said that was really a nice place because the water was only about 2 feet below the top of the bank, so they didn't have to pack it up the riverbank to get it out of there. Uh, I don't know if you've heard of a fellow named J.K. Ralston. He was an old timer. In fact, his family started over there in the Prickly Pear Valley out of Helena. And there's a book out called The Sound of the Curlew. And it was about the Ralston family's history. They started out over there in the Prickly Pear Valley, and then that family moved all over the place. But that book is available. And anyway, in that book, in one place, they were talking about an outfit that had come into the Missouri River to get freight, and then they were camping the first night out. They got up in the morning and they were short some oxen. Sent this kid out to get the oxen gathered up. Well, he was missing 2. So they had the kids stay in camp with the oxen they had, and these other 2 guys went looking for him. Well, they found him. Yeah, the Indians had gotten him. And while they were gone looking for him, the Indians come into camp and killed the kid and got the rest of the oxen. So it's not a very profitable move. So. One time when Granddad, and I don't know what river it was coming through there, but they had to cross this river and it had rain, and the water had been pretty high and it was muddy and slick, and said there was a teamster ahead of him with horses and he was stuck trying to get out of this river. And Granddad went on across, and the guy said, "Hook on in front of me and help me pull this out." Granddad said, "No." He said, "You unhitch and I'll pull you out." "Oh, those oxen can't do that." Granddad said, "Well, it's up to you. You either unhitch or I'm going on." Said the guy did, and he hooked those oxen, called them bulls a lot of times, hitched onto that wagon and just walked up the bank with it, and away they went.
Really?
I talked about this bellows. And then I'm getting on ahead of things here. These notes I just wrote down as I thought. They're not in any chronological order. So. Is that a word? In 1945, well, my sister and I were born just up the creek from the Cornwell Ranch headquarters. Excuse me. Anyway, my sister was 7 years old, and she was starting school, and so we moved down to the river place there. It was owned by Fred Weigel at the time. And my dad and his brother dug a well with one of those hand post hole diggers, 28 feet. And they hit gravel, and they couldn't dig any further. So they called a well driller with one of those old spud well drilling outfits. He come over and drilled 4 more feet and cased the hole and charged them for the complete thing. The house that we lived in there, I'm sure a lot of you know Kitty Lou Rusher. This house was bought from her father-in-law, John Rusher. And it's set up here on the hill across from the John Deere outfit. I don't know what Dad paid for it, couldn't have been much, but, and then the barn on that place sat kind of right there where the John Deere dealership is, and at the time, it was a community hall. It had tongue and groove flooring in it and windows all the way around. And anyway, I had to tear the floor out of it and moved it out there for a barn, of course. And then on the winter of 49 and 50 was a tough winter. A lot of snow, and we were feeding with a team and a sled. And the cows were right on the mouth of Buggy Creek, and the cows were across Buggy Creek, but the hay was on this side. And of course, the teams and the sleds made a trail. And as I remember it, that trail, when the snow left, that trail was about this tall. And it never melted away until the 1st of June. But then going to school, I think that was in the spring of 50, March of 1950. Had a heck of a blizzard through that country. And couldn't go home. The older kids stayed in the schoolhouse. And us younger kids went down to Madge and Ernie's house, Gary, to spend the night. And we all held hands going down there, and it's not that far, but that wind had blown the snow right through our coats by the time we got there. Oh, and then here's another thing, talking about blizzards. Years ago when Granddad had sheep and you'd get a heck of a snowstorm, and of course your animals would drift with it, and Dad said they'd go off a bank and hold up and the snow would drift right out over the top of them. And he said you'd go looking for the sheep, and he said you'd find an air hole in the snowbank, and there'd be a live sheep down there breathing, and they'd dig them out and take them home, you know. Shearing sheep, I brought some equipment with me. I don't have a sheep, or I'd show you how it's done. Excuse me. I never did see anybody shear sheep with one of these. I used to trim lambs for the kids for the fair, but they told me that they didn't do a lot of this. It was a sweep up the back on the straight part of their body, you know. And then they got real modern and went to this. And it was, the shearing plant that my granddad had was north of the highway up here in Buggy Creek, but there was a shaft along the wall. And every so often there was a clutch mechanism. And then the shaft came down, it was in two sections and hooked into this. I don't remember just what I think there was a handle up there on that clutch that had a rope tied to it, and they could pull that, but in those days, this is what I grew up watching. The shearers, these fleece ties, they didn't have the clips on them then, but the fleece ties came in bundles of 100. And they'd hang a bundle at each shearer's station. And then the fleece tire, he'd have these around his waist, some too, because every once in a while he'd break a string. Well, he couldn't take another one from that shearer because that was his tally. So he'd have some of these and he'd pull one out and retie that fleece. And then they had a sacking frame. It was on 4 legs, and I wish I had a wool sack, but these sacking frames were on 4 legs, and they had a plywood square about like this at the top, and then you had a round hole. These sacks, I'm going to say, were about 2 feet across, and they had a steel ring. Then they'd pull the sack up through that, and then when they'd set it down, that would hold the sack, and then they'd throw the fleeces up there. And my dad's brother-in-law, Eddie DeBow, could really pack wool. So back then, the fleeces on these Rambouillet sheep only weighed 6 or 7 pounds, and it was short, you know, not very long and fine wool. And I can remember being up there when they were probably half done shearing, and there's wool sacks all over full of wool. But we also had sheep ticks back in those days. Nice sunny day, and the sheep ticks were crawling out through the sacks and crawling all over these bags of wool. But anyway, Eddie DeVoe, Dad said he could tromp wool like anybody he ever saw. He said he could split a wool sack. But when you're tromping that wool, you don't just get in the middle, you tromp it down around the edge of the sack, and it keeps pushing it down, you know. But yeah, he said he'd seen Ed split sacks and then have to sew them back up. Oh, and one of my granddad's sayings was, the best price you can get for what you have to sell is the price you get the day you sell it.
Oh, that's a good one.
Then Granddad started out with all sheep. In fact, I'll go back to that a little bit. He worked over there in the Helena Valley for 5 years, and he got some money put together, borrowed some more money and bought a bunch of sheep, and he unloaded them up here in Hinsdale and trailed them up north about, I don't know, I suppose it's 15 miles up there. And he wintered in a dugout. And I've been up there and seen that. It wasn't very big. It wasn't a fourth the size of that Bonton right there. Excuse me. But, and then over years why they come down, he married Ida Raub. The Raub place is up Rock Creek there north of Hinsdale. I'm not so sure Funks don't have it now. But Grandma Cornwell supposedly was born in the state of Washington, a town called Tenawawa, which I'm assuming is an Indian name of some kind. Excuse me. I growl a lot, but I'm not contagious. Anyway, then they built up a few cows, and Granddad, this would have been in the, I'm going to say maybe the mid-30s or something. He decided he was going to sell all the cows and go back to straight sheep. Well, my dad liked cows, and he said that he and his older brother were sent out to gather these cows, and he said he rode up on the end of this ridge between two drainages, said there was kind of a basin there, said there were 12 pair bedded down in that basin. He said, I sat there and smoked 2 or 3 cigarettes and then just turned around and rode off. And then in 1949, Granddad sold all of the sheep and went straight cows. Another thing, Granddad, in years ago, of course, they did everything with teams, but they raised mules. And he and a partner had what they called a mammoth jack. They weighed 1,200 pounds or so, they were big, and Belgian mares. And then when they switched over to tractor power, Dad said they shipped 17 carloads of mules and horses out of Tampico.
Wow.
But he said in the spring, they just let those horses and stuff run in the wintertime. He said in the spring, why Dad and his brother go up and gather these. He said they'd get to the ranch with these horses. They'd have 600-700 head of horses. Then they'd sort the neighbors' stuff out and send them home and start breaking teams. And he said a lot of these teams, you had to re-break them every year. And I always remember he said they'd go to the hay meadow with 28 teams. Excuse me. And they'd switch teams at noon. They ran 7 mowers, 4 dump rakes, and then when the hay got dried, they'd run 2 buck rakes and then a stacker team. And going along that line of thought, there was a fellow lived out there, Gary knows where it's at, just across the river, that Dunphy Slough, a fellow by the name of Andy Dunphy. And he had a buck rake team, and this one horse would balk. And apparently Andy had one of these sticks. They used to take wire and tie 2 sticks in the end of it to throw over the stack to hold the top down until it settled. And apparently he had one of these with him. He said he stood up on that buck rake and whacked that old horse, and the horse jumped ahead, and Andy fell down in and stuff. And he gets dug out, and he said, "Hurt did it, just what I wanted it to do." And my dad had, when we lived there on the river, he had a black team. I'm assuming they were probably Percheron, but don't know for sure. But they had a habit, and he was right out in front of the house one day loading hay on a hay rack, bobsled, wagon, wagon. And he hung his jacket on the A-frame in the back of this hay rack, just finished loading it, and he stepped back there to get his jacket, and those horses took off. Turned and tipped the wagon over, run out in the field and hit a ditch and bounced the reach pin out, so he lost the back axle. They made a loop out around there and started up the river, and they ran into a tree, and that's what stopped them. And he said I was so mad, he said I went and got my saddle horse and got them, and he said I would run them all the way to the ranch, and he said it didn't help a bit, so. Then here's a note about Harry Alden watching the guy hitch his oxen up. Back in the days when they used to do loose hay, and they'd get a bunch of Mexican labor up here to work in the sugar beet fields. And when the beets come up, then they'd have to thin them so they had room to develop. Well, then they didn't have anything to do, so the ranchers would hire them in the hay fields. And Dad said these two Mexicans were up on this stack, and they're supposed to keep the sides straight, and he said it was coming out like this, and he's trying to get these guys, because they couldn't speak or understand English, you know. And he's trying to get these guys to pull that stack back in. Finally, he said, I got up, and he said I went like that and went like this. And he said they laughed like heck, but they pulled the stack in. Then we got to, in later years, after my wife was with me, the winter of 64 and 5, 1964 and 5. You know, and it was interesting. We had two daughters then, and Gwen had gone to Missouri with her folks to visit relatives down there. And that storm hit, and it was like, it was either 35 below and 30 mile an hour wind or vice versa for about a week. And the house, we still have the old part of the house, we've added onto it, but there was an old coal furnace in the basement, big metal enclosed thing, and they had changed it over to an oil pot. And then there were heat ducts. Well, there was a partition come out, just a wide doorway, but this wall come out probably 5 feet, Gwen. And there was a heat register on each side of it. This big pipe come up, and there was an outlet on each side. And the thermometer was up here. It was 52 degrees in that house, right over the heater. Thank God they were in Missouri. And when they got back, our bedroom was on the northwest corner of the house, and there was still a snowbank underneath the sill behind the dresser.
Oh.
A long time after the storm had gone by. Well insulated. And then here's when my sister and I were little, we lived on Spring Creek up above the ranch house up there at Cornwell Ranch, and she had a pet chicken. And she'd pull a string along with something on it, and that chicken would follow her. And she was running backwards, leading the chicken around, and she fell off the creek bank. That didn't hurt her very bad, but anyway, she told my mom, she said, you know, it was kind of fun flying through the air till I hit the ground. My dad and another fella wintered the sheep above Buggy Creek, up Buggy Creek above the highway, and the hay was all down towards the river. But anyway, they had 2 teams with sleds, and he would take both of those and go to the river and load them for hay for the next day. And he said there were times, of course this in the 30s when it was so darn bad, he said there were times when he had to get off and walk behind the sleds to stay warm, because he couldn't keep warm sitting up there on the sled. But anyway, he and this other fellow were wintering these sheep, and they'd take turns cooking. And the deal was that the first guy that complained about the cooking had to do it all. Well, they had the flour sack, and they just make biscuits in the top of the flour sack, you know. They had a pint jar with holes poked in the lid for a salt shaker. Well, the other guy had used some salt, and he didn't screw the lid back on.
Oh.
So all the salt went in the flour sack. Dad said he scooped all of it out that he could, went in and made the biscuits. That guy sat down and ate, and said, damn, these biscuits are salty, but they're sure good. Then this is kind of another story that I've always enjoyed. Dorothy will appreciate this. An old gentleman that lived north of town up here by the name of Wib Dawson. And he was a horseman, and he was coming to town one day from up there, and he notices this fella coming across country horseback, and so he stopped and waited for him to get to the highway, and here it was George Cox, the Methodist minister. And anyway, Webb said, well, that's a pretty good looking horse, wouldn't you want to sell him? Well, George said, well, yeah, I suppose. Webb said, well, I gotta try him first. Well, George said, all right, but you need to know this is a preacher's horse, so if you want him to go, you say Jesus Christ, and if you want him to stop, you say amen. And so Webb's going across country, and he's getting over there towards that Cherry Creek Ridge, and he knows it just like that, you know, and he's going along a pretty good lope, and this, he starts pulling on this horse, and nothing's happening. And finally he remembered, and he yells, Jesus Christ, no, amen. And the old horse slides up right to the edge, and Webb looks over the edge and says, Jesus Christ. Oh, and here's another note too. My grandma Cornwell, I can't remember the family name from way back then, but back in the New England states, apparently a relative of hers was one of the people instrumental in forming the West Point Academy for the military.
Wow.
And here's one my dad always pulled on us. He'd come around where he's at and say, well, what are you looking for? Well, nothing. Well, you got something to put it in? Well, no. Well, what are you going to do with it when you find it? Well, never had an answer, you know. But I pulled that on our granddaughter Tammy one time. Anyway, I pulled that on her, and I said, well, what are you going to do with it when you find it? She said, guess I'll just leave it here.
Excuse me, bud, I hate to interrupt, but for my chronological thinking, what year were you born?
1940,
Okay, thank you,
2nd of February,
thank you, appreciate that.
on my dad's 30th birthday. And we got our first great-grandson 3 years ago on my birthday.
Oh, wow, very cool.
And people say, well, did they name him after you? And I said, no, and thank goodness he don't look like me. Oh, and back to the shearing. I think it was like, well, when they come out with the plastic baler twine. And the Kodak company developed a plastic baler twine that was black. And I bought some hay from the Bernard brothers. They're West Tampico, that Walt Snyder had baled for them, and he used this black plastic twine. And I bundled it up and threw it in a chokecherry bush there on the river place, and that stuff hung there until I got tired of looking at it, and I've still found some that's still, you can't break it.
Mhm.
And the worst thing that can happen to a fleece, when the knotters on the small square balers at least, they'd kick out a little piece of twine about that long out of the twine holder. And if that'd get in a fleece, it wouldn't dissolve, and it's actually more detrimental than cockleburrs because you couldn't comb them out. My dad had a kind of a sense of humor. He, what do you think he called butter? Skid grease.
Wow.
And syrup was sticky goo. And then Mom made beautiful lemon meringue pies, but Dad called the meringue calf slobbers. Oh, did you ever see a horse cow? My sister, we had some bum calves there on that river place, And he made a pet out of this one. And when it was, I don't know, a year or so old, she put a saddle on it and broke it to ride, had a bit in its mouth just like a horse. And she was riding around one day and Dad was on up the river doing something. And here come the horses just on the fly up the river. And pretty soon here come my sister on this dang cow and scared the heck out of the horses. And then we got to cutting ice in the river in the wintertime. They tell me that's what Dad was doing the day I was born. But right there at Tampico, I don't know, Gary, do you remember this? They used to back trucks down the river bank right there in that bend right across the river from Seaver's house.
Yeah.
And cut ice there. And I don't know, I was pretty little then, but I'm assuming these ice cakes were about a foot, and then however deep it was, and maybe 2 feet long. And they'd put a wooden ramp with sideboards in the water, and then use a hook, and they'd slide those up out of the water, and when they hit the truck bed and stopped, they'd freeze down. They didn't have to tie them down. But, and then the ice house up on Cornwell Ranch was, I'm sure, built out of logs. It's been years since it's been gone, but then you covered it with straw to keep it from melting. And then a lot of the ice house on the place I'm living, it was made out of railroad ties. But, and a lot of you probably remember Art Kotaki, he had the Johnny Cafe. Wes Scott tells me that when he was first a kid, why Art delivered ice around town. And he said they always waited for him to come by and stop in their neighborhood because they could run out there and get ice chips out of their wagon and have something to suck on. I guess I'm about running out of notes, Lita. Oh, this saddle mule of Granddad's, I gotta tell you about that. He had a little sorrel mule that he rode. And mules being mules, he was gonna go do something north of the ranch horseback one day, and this mule was in the crowd, and when he opened the gate to lead his horse out, the mule ducked out. Started up over the hill, and he said he spent so much time trying to get that mule back in the corral that he didn't have time to go do the job he'd set out to do. So he's going back and he opens the gate, leads his horse in, the mule ducked back in the corral right beside him.
I was just gonna comment, you might relate my trip down to Heritage in Maryland and how Grandpa had.
Yeah. Granddad Cornwell, the ranch place out there now, there are 7 good springs within a half mile of that house. And I think they've worked 4 of them into a piping system. And years ago, before they built the new house in 52, this water line came down underground, came into the old log house, up and over like this, and fell into a 30-gallon stone crock that had an overflow in the middle of it. And then that would overflow and go down and go underneath the creek and into a water tank in the corral for livestock. And the only problem they ever had with it, I guess once in a while the frogs would plug up the mouths of the pipe in the springs, they had to go dig them out. But Gwen had family back in Maryland, and they went back, was it after your mom passed away? Yeah, she and her sister went back there to see that place, and she said to walk into that area, and it looked just like Cornwell Ranch out here. There were springs and the buildings and everything, and then she said there was a great big boulder on the corner of the property. But just, you know, and of course, like I say, Granddad was born in Maryland, the story I had, and then they moved to West Virginia, and then he came out here in '87. But yeah, They probably brought those same thoughts with them. Find a place.
That's what I thought.
Now, what family was it up north that had the house on top of the hill and the well was down here?
Beckers.
Oh, yeah. Harris
Becker.
Becker and his wife. So they had to walk down in the coulee, pump the water, and then pack it back up the hill. And then the wool sacking, like say back in the old days, they did it in this frame. Then they went on to, Ralph Dreyer's son-in-law was a professional shearer. And he had a hydraulic wool packer. It was on a frame on an axle, had a long hydraulic cylinder, and he laid this sack in this way, and it just packed that wool in this way. And then I kinda got out of the business, but I think then later on, they went to a square plastic container to put this wool in. And I don't know if that time if they even tied the fleeces. But, I quit shearing before I got to that point. I sheared just enough sheep to know that those guys earned every nickel they got. Another interesting deal, there was a fellow lived south of the river there at Nashua. He had a little bunch of sheep, and I went down there to shear them. And his ram was a 2-year-old ram that he'd raised from a bone lamb. He wasn't docked, he had his full tail, and he'd never been shorn. And I got his belly opened up, and I had to have the guy come and pull the wool away so I could make another pass. That fleece had a staple length of 9 inches, and a lot of times if a sheep goes through a little upset, why they'll get a thin spot in their wool, and then it will break there if you pull on it. There was not a break in that wool. 9-inch staple length and just plumb solid. He sheared 24 pounds.
How, on the wool sacks, how heavy would they be and how did you handle them?
Very carefully. Well, and I wish I'd had one, but they used to take the sack before it was filled and sew what we called an ear. They take the corner of the sack and tie some string around with a little bit of wool in there so you had a handle, and then the same on the other end. Back then, I really don't know what they weighed, but I had a little bunch of sheep out here, and a fellow come and sheared them, and we just stacked the fleeces up, and then the next day I went and got a sacking frame, and that bag of wool weighed over 400 pounds. And Jimmy Lawrence was getting wool from John Richardson up there at Opine. And we hauled that up there in a 1/2-ton pickup, and Jimmy and I got it in the boxcar to weigh it, but yeah, it was 400 pounds.
Well, and these wool sacks are like gun sacks. So
Yeah, burlap bag, but yeah. Well, did you know, I don't know how that a sheep tick is actually called a ked. It's a sheep ked, and it's both sexes. One of them can reproduce all by itself. And of course, thankfully nowadays they have some chemicals that we can just pour a little bit on the sheep and get rid of them, you know. But I guess that's about all I've got, Peter.
All right, anybody have any questions or comments?
Did you go to school in Tampico, or was that?
Yeah.
Yeah, at that time, was there a couple stores going?
There was one store, yeah. Richard Motzkow had the hardware store there and a repair shop. And then his mother had the post office. And then Richard's sister, Elsie, married a fellow by the name of Sam Zink, and they ran the grocery store. Thanks for bringing that up, John, because when we went to school there, if it was your birthday, well, your mom would send a cake to school with you. And then you could go down to the grocery store and get these little nickel Dixie cups of ice cream and just have a whale of a party at schoolhouse. Then we used to do the Christmas programs in the Tampico Hall. Yeah, remember Doug Martin, Gary's little brother? They'd have the preschool kids say something in between when they were getting behind the curtains ready. They said, Doug had this piece that he was gonna say, and said he walked out in front of the curtain and he looked around and he said, too many girls, and just turned around and went back. But he turned out to be a heck of a rock rider.
So, did your family ship all their stuff out of Tampico? Like that was an option,
Pretty
you
much,
could bring all
yeah.
their stuff there and just ship it?
Yeah, and the Edshart Ranch, they run their sheep up here on Porcupine in the summer, and then they ship the lambs out of Tampico and then trail the ewes south out to Willow Creek. Yeah, that was a big occasion, and everybody shipped, there used to be a grain elevator there too, you know, yeah. A lot of things have gone.
So also just, something that I hear about since I've been working here is that skidoo. Did
The
you ever
skidoo?
ride that? Yeah,
Yeah, that was a local train. Yeah.
and you just could hop on it for no money?
Excuse me.
You didn't have to pay for it, you could just hop in?
Oh, I'm sure you
Ride
did.
to Glasgow?
I'm sure you did. They never let me ride it, but knowing my dad was always gonna get me right in a steam engine when they were spotting cars and stuff too, but that never did happen either. But, no, the skidoo, I know Gary probably knows as much about it as I do. It was, just a little steam engine and maybe 3 or 4 cars in a caboose. And I don't, Gary, was that the one that went up towards Whitewater?
No.
It went to Malta.
Went to Malta and back?
I know it went
Yeah.
to Malta because I rode it to Malta.
Cause it was just kind of a local train, right?
Kind of.
Yeah,
Very from
yeah,
on the highway.
yeah. Dad told one time, back in the 30s when everything was going broke, a guy needed a wagon. And he supposedly got on a freight train in Glasgow that had wagon parts on it. Then he got out that way and he started throwing wagon parts off.
Oh,
And he got a complete wagon, but he had 4 back wheels. He said it pulled really easy, but it wouldn't turn very short. You know, and I can remember, I don't remember what year it was when they went to diesel electrics, but when we were going to school there at Tampico, you could hear those steam locomotives leave Glasgow in the wintertime, and that sound would just grow,
really?
you know, yeah. And Dad said you could always tell a good engineer, he'd never spin a wheel. He worked that clever and just get all the power he could, but never make a wheel slip. Anything else? Well, thanks for putting up with me.